Hi students. Today we're going to continue our discussion of legal interpretation by looking at a case called Smith versus U.S., John Smith versus the United States. This case is from 1993, so much more recent than the case we looked at last time, 100 years later, right? But it's still been a while since this case was tried. Now, as you might suspect from the picture we've got here, we've got a case that involves guns and drugs. What could be more exciting and interesting than that? In particular, we've got a MAC-10, which I believe is the gun pictured on the right, and cocaine, which is on the left, obviously. Okay, so before we get into the sort of legal, philosophical issues, we wanted to start with the facts of the case. Now, if you've read the case, you know a little bit more detail than this, but the basic idea is that you have a guy, John Angus Smith, who tried to buy cocaine with his MAC-10. So he said, you give me cocaine, I'll give you my MAC-10, this will be great. Unfortunately for Smith, the person that he tried to buy it from was an undercover police officer, so that was bad news for him. As a result, Smith was indicted on drug trafficking charges and alleged to have used a firearm during and in relation to a drug trafficking crime. Now, the reason this is significant is because some crimes have sort of increased penalties when you do something else in conjunction with that crime. So, for example, there's this felony murder law where if you're involved in a felony, you know, you're participating in a felony crime and someone gets killed, murdered during the commission of that crime, even if it wasn't you that committed the murder, you're going to get charged with murder because you were part of the felony that led to the murder. And so something like that is happening here, right? We've got this case where what Smith is doing is he's just trying to buy cocaine, but he's doing it, and the reason there's this sort of the law here was made was presumably because they didn't want people like also bringing guns to the places where they're exchanging money for drugs. So there's this law that says you can't use a firearm during and in relation to a drug trafficking crime. If you do, then your sort of sentence gets bumped up. And so that's the sort of central legal question here. Does trading a firearm for drugs constitute use of the firearm within the meaning of the relevant law, which is 18 U.S.C. section 924C1. So in order to answer that question, right, we really need to know what that law says. So here's that law. It requires the imposition of specified penalties if the defendant, during and in relation to any crime of violence or drug trafficking crime, uses or carries a firearm. By its terms, the statute requires the prosecution to make two showings. First, the prosecution must demonstrate that the defendant used or carried a firearm. Second, it must prove that the use or carrying was during and in relation to a crime of violence or drug trafficking crime. So they have to have used or carried the firearm. Second, it must be that the use or carry was during and in relation to the crime. All right, so the question is, was Smith's act of selling the gun for drugs a violation of this law? Did he use a firearm during and in relation to a drug trafficking crime? Now, this is a tricky case for obvious reasons, right? You might think, oh man, clearly there's a gun involved. Did he use the gun in the right kind of way during and in relation to the drug trafficking crime? So this is something you should think about, right, for yourself. How would you rule in this case, knowing what you know? And also, you know, if you've read the case already, think back. What did they rule? How did they decide? Who do I kind of side with? What would my argument be? Right? Whenever we're thinking about a question like this, did someone do X? Are they guilty of Y? We want to think about not just what my position is, but what's my reasoning? Why do I think that that's the right view? Okay, so to begin, we're going to look at the majority opinion, and that's written by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. She was a pretty significant justice of the Supreme Court during this time. So we'll see a number of opinions that sort of are written by her, because she was if there's sort of the court's divided into relatively like liberal jurors and more conservative jurors, Justice O'Connor is kind of in the middle, and so wherever Justice O'Connor goes, so went the Supreme Court in many of the most controversial cases. Okay, so in her opinion, she says, when a word is not defined by statute, like use in this case, we normally construe it in accord with its ordinary or natural meaning. So that's the first thing she says. And then the next thing, surely, she says, petitioner, that is Smith's, treatment of his Mac 10 can be described as use within the everyday meaning of the term. So if we want to know whether he used it in relation to a drug trafficking crime, we just say, well, did he use it? Yeah, it seems like that counts as use. Was it in relation to, during, and in relation to a drug trafficking crime? She thinks yes. So she's going to ultimately rule that Smith is guilty. So here's her argument. So if a word is not defined by a statute, then we should construe it in accord with its ordinary or natural meaning. The word use is not defined in this law, so we should construe it in accord with its ordinary or natural meaning. Premise 3, and this is sort of where the controversy is going to come in. She says, if we should construe the word use in this law in accord with its ordinary or natural meaning, then if we can truly say that Smith used a gun to facilitate a drug trafficking crime, then we should find Smith guilty. So what we're really looking for is this bit right here. If we can truly say that Smith used a gun to facilitate a drug trafficking crime, then we should find Smith guilty. Premise 4, she thinks we can truly say that Smith used a gun to facilitate a drug trafficking crime, and therefore she thinks we should find Smith guilty. So the controversial premise in this argument is premise 3, and that's the one that Scalia, who's going to give a dissenting opinion, is going to disagree with. Now, to support premise 3, right, she sort of has us imagine, right, what does it mean to use a gun to facilitate a drug trafficking crime? What would count here? Obviously, firing it would count as use. If you pistol whip someone, that would be use too. It's probably not what the law, right, was like primarily worried about, but the law use seems to cover that kind of case. She also thinks like using as in handing it over, right, to facilitate the crime, right, that's another way you could use it. So again, not the maybe paradigmatic example of use, but all of those count. What doesn't count, she thinks, is something like scratching your head with the gun. So I think this is a scene from like Sherlock Holmes or something. I guess he like scratches his head with a loaded gun. Not a great strategy, but so scratching your head with a gun isn't really using it. It's not really facilitating the crime, right? So that gets an X, right? If he had done that, he wouldn't be guilty of using, but because he did one of sort of the other kinds of things that do count as use, that do facilitate a drug trafficking crime, we're going to find him guilty. The defendant who uses, she says, a firearm to scratch his head or for some other innocuous purpose would avoid punishment for that conduct altogether. Although scratching one's head with a gun might constitute use, that action cannot support punishment under this law unless it facilitates or furthers the crime and that the firearm served to relieve. An itch is not enough. Okay, so that's her view. So now we're going to take a look at Justice Scalia's dissenting opinion. Now, dissenting opinions, sometimes there could be multiple in a particular case, or they could just be one. In this case, Justice Scalia wrote this dissenting opinion, but you can see that a couple other justices agree with it. So basically, they don't want to all have to write their own opinions in certain cases. It's enough sometimes for one person to say, like, here's why I disagree, and the other justices are like, yeah, that's basically why I disagree too, so I'll just sign on with yours. So in his dissenting opinion, he says, the meaning of a word cannot be determined in isolation, but must be drawn from the context in which it's used. Then he says, and this is like sort of a weird way of saying it maybe, but he says to use an instrumentality, use an instrument ordinarily means to use it for its intended purpose. So when we say, use a firearm, we're not thinking about like all the myriad of ways you could possibly use it, but rather when we say use a firearm, we mean use it in the way that it's typically used. So his legal argument that mirrors Sandra Day O'Connor's, right? If a word's not defined, then we should construe it in accordance with an ordinary natural meaning. The word use is not defined, so we should construe it in accordance with its ordinary natural meaning. I think it's important to note, like, they both agree on that. Like, they say it's not defined, we give it its ordinary or natural meaning. They don't disagree about that. What they disagree about is this part here, right? If we should construe the word use in this law in accordance with its ordinary or natural meaning, for Scalia, he has a different sort of thing that we should take away. He says, then we should find Smith guilty only if he used a gun in the way that guns are ordinarily used to facilitate a drug trafficking crime. So the question isn't just like, did he use it at all in any way whatsoever to facilitate the crime, but rather, did he use it in the way that guns are ordinarily used to facilitate drug trafficking crimes? Premise 4 says that Smith did not use a gun in the way that guns are ordinarily used to facilitate a drug trafficking crime. So the logic here is maybe a little bit trickier. The thought is, if we should do this in accordance with the natural meaning, okay, then we should find Smith guilty only if he used a gun in the way that guns are ordinarily used. But Smith didn't do that, so we should not find Smith guilty. So that's how the argument goes. Now, Scalia, like Sandra Day O'Connor, proposes a slightly sort of different kind of question. He gives this example of the question, do I use a cane? And the thought is like, if you use a cane like this, right, you use it to help you walk around, then you use a cane. What about, do I use a cane to beat people over the head with that? That's not what the question's getting at, right? Not asking, have you ever beaten your kids with a cane or something like that. It's not asking like, do you put candy canes on your Christmas tree at Christmas time or something like that. So again, when we ask someone whether they use a cane or whether they used a gun in a drug trafficking crime, we're not really asking these bizarre, rare ways that technically I do because I use it on my Christmas tree. No, he's saying, do you use a cane in the ordinary type of way? That's the question. So Scalia says, it's unquestionably not reasonable and normal, I think, to say simply, do not use firearms when you mean to prohibit selling or scratching with them. So what we would use firearms for is like shooting or something. But if you want to prohibit selling, you don't just say, well, don't use firearms at all. You say, don't sell, don't scratch with a firearm, something like that. You need to be more specific. Okay, so that's Scalia's first legal argument. There's another legal argument he gives right at the end, sort of the last paragraph there. And this is, I think, it's sort of just I find this just sort of interesting on its own. It's sort of a separate issue, but Scalia says, if the correct interpretation of a statute is unclear, then by the rule of lenity, we should rule in favor of the accused. So the idea here is that there's this sort of maxim of the fundamental maxim of the law that says when the interpretation is unclear, then we should be lenient toward the person accused. And this makes sense, right? If a statute's really hard to interpret, then we generally should say like, well, let's give this person the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they were trying to follow it, but they just messed up because it's tricky to understand. So premise 2 of this argument then goes, the correct interpretation of this particular law is unclear. Conclusion, we should rule in favor of Smith. So that's a second kind of argument. I think Scalia is sort of saying, even if you got some Sandra Day O'Connor, you're sort of right, it's unclear about whether we should go with my interpretation or your interpretation, at least we can agree that it's a tricky situation and we should be lenient in that kind of case. All right, so that's the end of that case. What we'll be looking at next time is Scalia's theory, right? So we get a reading, common law courts in a civil law system, the role of the United States federal courts in interpreting the Constitution and laws. So this is from his, I think from his book that he wrote. So we're going to read a little bit about that. He's going to talk about the two cases we've discussed most recently, Church of the Holy Trinity versus U.S. and Smith versus U.S., and sort of helping us to see how his legal interpretation, theory of legal interpretation works, and we'll sort of sort through that. So read that, do the associated reading quiz, and we'll see you next time.